Welcome everyone to Northumberland. This is perhaps my favourite county in all of England. Rolling hills make some absolutely wonderful vistas and gorgeous landscapes to look out on, and scattered in between those hills are some of the most unique and unforgettable little villages. As you walk through this wonderful county, it's hard to imagine that this was once the edge of one of the greatest empires that the world has ever seen. But every so often, echoes in the landscape remind us of what's come before. Just take a look at this. Behind me lies the vast ditch that's known as the Valom Hadriani. That was built by soldiers of the Roman Empire nearly 2,000 years ago. After 874 years of expansion, Rome decided it was time to draw a line in the sand, and that was where they drew it. The ditch was actually only half the plan, because in front of it he built a huge wall stretching 73 miles from coast to coast, with mile castles along the way and huge forts every 7 miles. It was an absolutely staggering achievement. Now, not much of the original wall remains, but trust me when I tell you there's just enough for it still to take your breath away. In this series, I'm going to take you on 8 walks across Northumberland. Starting in the east and working across to the west, we'll see some of the best sights this county has to offer. And along the way, we'll discover the story of the wall that put this county on the map. Welcome to Walking the Wall. Welcome everyone to the tiny hamlet of Halton in the county of Northumberland. We're in the northeast corner of England, and Scotland is about 40 miles in that direction as the crow flies. We're about to start an adventure that I've been dreaming of for years. Now, the countryside around here is absolutely stunning, and the story's just waiting to be discovered. But there's something about this place that makes it extra special, and that's because it holds a very special place in my heart. You see, anyone who knows me will tell you that I love all things to do with history, from the Romans to the Greeks and the Tudors to the Vikings. And if you were to ask me, where did my love of history begin? I could tell you, because it was right here. I was 10 years old. I'd come out on a school history trip, and we'd come to Hadrian's Wall, actually about 5 miles from this spot. And I was just transfixed by what I saw, and the seed that was planted on that trip became my love of history, because the Romans led me to the Greeks and then to the Egyptians, and then onto a lifelong love of everything to do with history. So if you were to ask me if I was excited about this series, my answer would be most definitely yes. In this first walk in the wall, we're visiting a part of Northumbria that I've never been to before. We're going to begin our epic quest along the Hadrians Wall Path. We'll also uncover the story of King Oswald of Northumbria. And finally, we'll visit one of the most unique sites of any of the forts all along Hadrian's Wall. Right now, though, it's time for me to do some serious walking. There's actually 70 castles still lived in to this day in Northumberland, and the most famous of all is probably Alnwick Castle, which is also known, of course, as Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, because it was used as a location for Hogwarts in the first two films. But not only that, it's not just Hogwarts, it's also the home of Bertie and Edith in Downton Abbey. I think that's the reason why I love it so much. Loads of castles, tons of history, hardly any people. My goodness, for me it doesn't get much better than that. But it was the Romans who brought me here as a child, and it's what they did here that's brought us here for this series. And how exactly did they end up in England? Well, they arrived in 43 AD into a land populated by Celtic tribes. This was a time before England, Scotland, Wales or Ireland even existed. And when they turned up, there was no stone roads, no stone buildings, and not a lot of order. So it was exactly 1,900 years ago that a brand new emperor by the name of Hadrian came out on a tour of his empire. And he made a pretty momentous decision, because for the 874 years prior to Hadrian becoming emperor, the Roman Empire had worked in a very specific way. They pushed outwards. Suddenly though, he made this huge decision to stop. It was time to draw a line in the sand, and we can see what's left of that line just up here. That on its own was quite the achievement. But the ditch was only half the story, because the main attraction was a 10-foot high, 15-foot wide wall. Now, you're expecting a giant wall to hove into view, aren't you? Well, the wonderful thing about Hadrian's Wall is it gradually reveals itself to you as we get further into the national park, which is that way. That's where all our walks are going to be through this series. It's a bit like reading a good book. If you suddenly got to the crux of the story in chapter 1, you wouldn't want to read the rest, would you? No. Hadrian's Wall gradually is going to unveil itself to us as we work our way through this series. But 1900 years ago, if we went back in time, the wall would be pretty much on where that tree line is. Right now, though, we're cresting the top of the Valom Hadriani, and I've never done this before. This is superb. The funny thing is though, the robbing out of the wall only happened on the bits that are close to each coast, and we're only 20 miles maximum from the east coast of England here. As you get into the central sections, where you get further away from where people used to live, because I mean, to be fair, it's similar now, but certainly back in those days people lived closer to water, so the further you got into the Northumberland National Park, the more wall that's left, because people couldn't be bothered to go there and rob it out. What's so disappointing though is just 250 years ago there was still loads of wall left here. You would have been able to see it from one coast to the other. There was one single event that wiped out the majority of Hadrian's Wall, and it was the building of the road, which we're just picking up now. We've made our way onto the national trail, which is going to form such a huge part of this series, because this is the Hadrians Wall Path. Now, I've had the privilege of walking along sections of this, never this bit, but sections of this before, and I've also run along it too, and let me tell you, it just doesn't get much better than this. Thousands of hardy walkers each year walk along this path, and you can actually get a book. It's like a passport, and within the passport there's little areas, and they're all named, and each of the named spots is somewhere along the wall, and what you do is you call in at that place, they stamp your book, and you do it just to prove that you've been to all the stops along the way on the Hadrian's Wall Path. My wife and I have actually dreamt of walking this path, because all along the way there's B&Bs, there's also some campsites, and there's some hotels that walkers normally book into along the way. And let me tell you, I'm too old for camping now, what with my height. I remember actually when I was a kid, as I just get over this rather cool style, whoa, this is epic. It's perfect actually. That's what I mean about this wall. It's so well maintained. It really is quite straightforward to get along. I've been on much worse paths is what I mean. You know, some gateways can be really sort of treacherous to get over. But yes, I remember camping as a kid. And even when I was like 15, 16, I was so tall that my head pushed like the top of the tent outwards and my feet pushed the bottom of the tent outwards. And anyone who's been camping will know if it rains and you're pushing at the top or the bottom, you're going to get wet. So I think we will do it one day, my wife and I. I'm telling you we will. But I think we'll do the B&Bs and the hotels. Fighter pilots have all the best fun, don't they? You're not telling me they didn't think, I know what we'll do for a laugh. We'll go and fly along the line of Hadrian's Wall. Of course they did. And who wouldn't? That's what I'd do. I've got to say, with the fighter planes, the very busy road, it's only for a short section, thankfully. Thanks to General Wade and his silly military road. But we've made it. We are now just on the outside of the wall because the road is built on top of the wall, so the line of the wall is right there. So this, in effect, now is barbarian country. We've turned off, we've left the Hadrians Wall Path behind us as we venture out into dangerous Celtic lands. We've actually turned onto another pretty impressive trail. This is St Oswalds Way. It starts a few miles back in that direction, just probably 4 or 5 miles, at a place called Heavenfield, which we're going to visit later on in the series. And it heads on up the coast this way, 97 miles, before it finishes on Lindisfarne. Round about that time, Christianity just hadn't taken off in England. There were small pockets of it, but nothing of any serious nature at all. It wasn't the case in Ireland. Ireland, it had gone absolutely crazy a couple of hundred years before that. And so when King Oswald became King of Northumbria, he decided that he wanted to convert his people to Christianity en masse, everyone. So he contacted Ireland and he asked them to send over a bishop, and they did. They sent over a man called Aidan. Oswald gave him the island of Lindisfarne, and from there Aidan set up a monastery, and my goodness, did he convert the people of Northumbria. They came in droves and Christianity took off in just a few years after Aidan arriving. Now, you might just recognise the names Holy Island and Heavenfield that I mentioned earlier on. That's where St Oswalds Way starts. They're actually the titles of two of the books from the DCI Ryan series written by L.J. Ross. I'm reading them at the moment, and my goodness, they're superb. And I can now tell you firsthand that she's just brilliant. L.J. Ross, she's the author. She is just brilliant at setting the scene, because it feels like I'm walking through the books as I'm walking along St Oswalds Way. It's just marvellous. Definitely worth a read. We're near well and truly north of Hadrian's Wall. It lies actually about 1.5 miles. We're actually just starting to turn back towards it now, but it's 1.5 miles in that direction. Now, you may have thought that crossing over was something that people just didn't do. I certainly did when I first came to visit here. I assumed it was one straight big wall with no crossing points, and anyone that came over here was going to get attacked by some Celtic warrior painted all blue. The truth is not quite so exciting. The reason why we know this is the mile castles and the forts. They had gates that would allow people to move from the north and to the south, and from the south and to the north. And if you had your papers and you paid a tax, you could do exactly that. So it was less of a defensive barrier, and it was actually more of a border control system. So you can bet the soldiers manning Hadrian's Wall felt awfully cosy looking out across Celtic no man's land. And it does raise an interesting question. Which way of life would you prefer? Well, the Celtic way of life was certainly close to nature. You lived a very rustic life. That's probably in a roundhouse, very close to your animals. But you fought a lot, and life expectancy was much lower than the Romans. Whilst the Romans brought with them flat roads, stone buildings, shops, a lot more safety, and really the roots of the Western civilization that so many of us live in today. What made the Romans so clever was the way they integrated the countries that they conquered. Because yes, there was certain criteria like money and respect that you needed before you could join the empire, but pretty much everyone, including slaves, eventually would get the opportunity to become a Roman citizen. Of course, there is a downside to that. You had to pay taxes. The question is, what would I do if you dropped me here in 122 AD? Would I stay here on the barbarian side and live a very rustic life, very close to nature, but probably with a high chance of me dying in some tribal dispute with another Celtic tribe? Or would I go on the Roman side with the straight roads, the swimming pools, the underfloor heating? It's not really a difficult decision, is it? I'd definitely opt for the Roman way of life. And with that in mind, I think we should find our way back to the Hadrian's Wall Path. So after successfully venturing north into the land of the Celts, I've made it back safely inside the line of Hadrian's Wall. I'm back on Hadrian's Wall Path, and to my right is the military road, which is of course sat right on top of where the wall once stood. So this would have been a really big place. Think of it like a walled town. And within the walled town lived the soldiers. Now, the soldiers who were garrisoned here, they were a cavalry unit, and they used to live with their horses. Their barracks would have on one side, there would be the places for the soldiers to live, and then attached on the other side, there would be all the stables. So it's quite a nice setup, really. And don't think that they weren't living in a certain amount of luxury, because Romans loved their luxury. And in 1827, some archaeological work was done just over the other side of this wall, and they found some seriously posh baths, really big baths, and Romans loved their baths, and supposedly these baths were the biggest and poshest that's ever been found all along the wall, so they must have been pretty impressive. Now, Roman forts followed a similar layout all across the empire. That meant no matter where you ended up, if you were a soldier or a legionary, as they were known, you knew where your barracks were and you knew where to get your food from. But don't think that it was just soldiers here on their own, because their families were here too. We're actually walking down. This is the main road that used to run through the fort. This is obviously a modern relay of that road, but this is the Via Pretoria, and the Via Pretoria used to run up to the Praetorium, which would have been just up there where those gates are, and that's where the commanding officer used to live, and he actually lived there with his family. But it wasn't just the commanding officer who got to see his family, because it was the common legionary too, who also had family in tow at forts all along Hadrian's Wall and across the empire actually. Just outside the fort, see, the common legionary wasn't as lucky as the commanding officer. The commanding officer got to have his family inside the fort. The common legionary, he would have to come outside of the fort to see his family in the settlement that formed just outside the walls. 1900 years ago, I'm sure there would have been some legionaries walking down this road on their way to some shore leave to spend some time with their families. Now, of course, Onnum Fort has now completely gone, as has the settlement which used to surround it. And actually, we will be later on in the series visiting some settlements, which there's lots there. There's grindstones and houses and all sorts. So looking forward to showing you those. But if you're wondering where all the stone went that was once here, we're actually heading to a place now that's being built pretty much completely by stone robbed from Onnum Fort. We're back where we started our walk today, in the little hamlet of Halton. Yeah, this place first appeared about 200 years after the Romans left. In fact, it's highly likely that things were going on here before that. But initially, the first stone buildings that were put in was like a manor hall that used to then govern the whole of the land around this area. Slowly but surely, properties and houses built up around to support that manor hall. And obviously a church was needed. So this one was built around 700 AD using stone from that fort that we'd just left. And it is, of course, named after Oswald, King of Northumbria, who we found out about earlier on today's walk. My goodness, it's certainly a humble little place. There's no stained glass windows. The floors are wooden, they're normally stone in churches. But you can just tell, you can feel that this was such a happy place. And you can see, I'm sure it still is a happy place because you can still get married here, which is marvellous, isn't it? There's still services here too. And you can see all around you stones cut specifically in the Roman way, so you know that these came from the fort. I think it's just amazing that 2,000 years later, the stones cut by those legionaries are still being used in wonderful buildings that we all can still enjoy. There's one last little treat in store for us before we finish today's walk, because I'm told that somewhere in this churchyard is a Roman altar. Now, Roman altars were traditionally placed outside of settlements, normally on the main road leading into that settlement, and that's exactly where we are now. If I can find this altar, I think there's a fair chance that it's probably not moved very far in the last 2,000 years. And I've never actually seen a Roman altar in the wild before, only in museums. Let's see if we can find it. My goodness, what a wonderful way to end our first walk in the wall. Looking at a Roman altar carved by a human being probably 2,000 years ago. My goodness, what a walk this has been. The person who carved that altar would have known the landscape that we've walked through today intimately, because this was their home, this was their world, and my goodness, it's been such a privilege, hasn't it, walking in their footsteps today. Folks, our adventure is truly underway now, and I can't wait to see you next time when we'll once again be walking the wall.